And I think
the first step for them.
Yeah, I think the really cool part about running group therapy is when a group of people who have a form of mental illness come into a room and they each start sharing a little bit about themselves, and they realize that they're not the only person who's suffering with this disorder.
Welcome to We Need to Talk, a series of conversations about mental health brought to you by the St. Louis Park Mental Health Action Committee. Today our host Jeanne Wolfe and her guest, therapist Jill Kramer, will be discussing various approaches to mental health, wellness, and recovery. In future episodes, we'll be discussing just about anything related to our mental health as we seek to raise awareness and suggest pathways to healing. But no matter what the issues, the first step is always acknowledging the problems and understanding that help is available, which is why we need to talk.
Can you speak a little bit about maybe what you're seeing these days as far as
the chemical trends?
Common? Yeah. Well, what are you seeing a lot of?
Right, and that's a great question because working in that field for 14 years, there definitely have been patterns that have been followed. What we can always count on is that alcoholism never goes out of style, or the addiction of alcohol. That one has always been prominent during my time working in the field. For a while, we did see a trend with the synthetic forms of marijuana, spice, K2. People could buy those at head shops or at smoke shops, and what ended up happening was we saw more people having psychotic breaks and ending up hospitalized, and so the state moved in and pulled those items off the shelves so people couldn't have such easy access, because it was really wreaking havoc on the mental health of our teens and our 20-somethings. But the biggest issue right now, I would say, are opioids. The reason why this one's so dangerous is because opiates are prescribed every day by doctors who are treating people's acute and chronic pain. Unfortunately, opioids are meant for acute pain, and doctors are overprescribing for people with chronic pain. And when people can no longer get those medications from their doctors, they're going out on the street and getting other forms of opioids, such as heroin or anything that they can get from their local street dealer.
When you say acute pain, what might be an example? Like if someone, is that maybe sometimes how it starts? Somebody
It can start that way.
Having some acute pain?
Right. So, I mean, a good example would be my mother just had her knee replaced, and so obviously it's going to be a painful surgery, it's going to be a painful recovery because you have to bend the joints of your knee and whatnot, and so she has to take opiates, every so many hours to even be able to do her physical therapy. So the acute pain is something that's not supposed to last. Chronic pain would be more like lupus or a back problem, but pain that has been there for a long period of time. And opiates aren't meant for that kind of pain. Opiates are meant for acute pain. So what's happening is people are going to their doctors or to the ER with their chronic pain and being given opiates, and hence sometimes that's where the addiction starts.
How big of a problem is that in Minnesota?
It's a pretty sizable problem that goes unrecognized, and for the reasons that people don't always want to see what's right in front of them. And this is the case for high schoolers, college-age kids, their parents not wanting to recognize that their child may have a problem. And one thing we see in our program are there are moments where we talk with families and they're willing to acknowledge the issue with alcohol, because that's more acceptable. But once you say your child is shooting up heroin, the denial goes up. They don't want to hear it. They don't want to believe it because of the magnitude of the problem. And then what am I supposed to do to help my child? Or the other question they ask themselves are, what did I miss?
How did I not know this was happening?
Right under my nose.
Right. If you're struggling with chemical dependency, when you talk about parents who maybe are in denial, how can that complicate someone's treatment?
Well, I think the best practice is to include the families and support people as much as humanly possible. The problems that we face with that are sometimes when people are over 18, they don't want their family involved because more family involvement means more accountability. Sometimes the parents are in a state of denial and don't want to be involved because acknowledging the problem would mean having to take a look across the board of the family system and what they can do to support this person. And sometimes parents will say, I don't think my child has a problem with drugs or alcohol.
And the child does think? Like they'll say, I
yes.
do, and the parents... Okay.
Sometimes, yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we definitely would like to involve as many people in someone's treatment because it's like your Verizon Wireless. You want a bunch of people behind you that are standing up and supporting you in this really hard journey. And in some ways, I mean, we have to be accountable for our own wellness, but also holding people accountable for their treatment, for their recovery, and saying, are you doing the things you need to do? Not that they're harping on them, but just checking in and saying, hey, are you going to your meetings, or are you taking your medication as prescribed, or are you making good choices? And people don't always want to get into that level of involvement because it can feel awkward.
Now, part of your work involves working with people with dual diagnosis?
Yes. For the last 14 years, I've been working at a program for people who have co-occurring disorders, a diagnosis of substance use disorder, and a diagnosis of mental health disorder. So what we do at the program I work at is we treat both simultaneously and not focus on one more than the other. It's sort of the wave for the future because we're finding out that a lot of substance abuse disorders have an underlying mental health disorder along with them.
What kind of used to be the approach?
People generally would just send people to a CD treatment, a chemical dependency treatment, and just focus on the chemical use and not really pay any attention to the underlying mental health issue that may have been a precursor to the use, or even ignoring past trauma, which is why some people would end up getting into chemical use in the first place. Our program has been around for about 20 years now, but now we're starting to see more and more programs having a dual diagnosis focus. And the state of Minnesota is acknowledging that integrated treatment is one of the best practices for these folks, instead of separating it out and going to a substance use disorder treatment program and then going to a mental health program.
When people go into that type of treatment, is it usually, can they kind of have that approach in a lot of different settings?
I think it depends on the severity of the illness and the disorder for the individual. Every person that we see in our program is assessed individually, and we decide what's the most appropriate placement for them. And sometimes that placement would be an inpatient or residential setting, provided that it's a dual diagnosis setting, or an outpatient setting, which in that case they would come to our program or any other various program in the community. One of the ways people are getting referred to dual diagnosis programs is through Rule 25 funding, when they don't have insurance to get substance use treatment. They go to the state of Minnesota and receive a Rule 25 assessment, and sometimes they will also refer them to inpatient or outpatient, wherever they deem appropriate at the time.
So you mentioned Rule 25. When you hear treatment, especially for chemical dependency, one of the things I think that is kind of associated with that is expensive.
Right.
You hear of
incredibly expensive.
Yeah, and I think just anecdotally, you hear of people who maybe have gone through treatment once or twice, whether it's families who have supported people through treatment, and that it's not an inexpensive service.
You are absolutely on the dot with that. The cost for treatment is, for some people, it's astronomical. I mean, we are living in a society where we are working longer hours to try to pay the bills, and so a lot of times people will avoid treatment for that reason, because they look at it as an expense or something that I can't afford it.
Right.
And so I think that first and foremost, trying to find the root of the problem. Oftentimes the way people get into treatment is that there's some kind of chaotic event that brings them to the emergency department. And that's where it's usually diagnosed that maybe their chemical use is becoming a little bit, has gotten out of control, so to speak. And oftentimes those are the people that will refer to various treatment programs and say, here, call this place or call that place and what have you, and just kind of getting the ball rolling. For people who really don't know where to get started, the ER is an option. For people who live in Hennepin County, they can access front door services. It's the main number for the Health and Human Services for Hennepin County.
Okay.
I know Dakota County and Ramsey County also have, intake numbers. People can call and ask to get help. Also, people can call 211 to get information.
Okay.
But as far as the Rule 25, it really it boils down to what is your funding. Some insurances will cover. Oftentimes, people's insurance will deny them coverage, and then Rule 25 is another option. And there are Rule 25 offices set up in every county of Minnesota. So simply Googling the number for the county you're in, you can get that number and call them and ask to set up an appointment. Some hospitals, if people have been in the hospital or been hospitalized for mental health and chemical use disorder, some hospitals will be able to have people on site to do the Rule 25 assessment.
Okay.
For other people, they just refer them to go to the office. When they're going for Rule 25, they're identifying that their substance use disorder is primary.
Okay.
And so other ways to go about this is to do a dual diagnosis and then have the mental health diagnosis primary, and then the insurance may cover it that way.
Okay.
But it can be rather complex. It poses a lot of problems for people, and a lot of times people see that as a barrier to getting help.
Yeah.
Because there's too much to figure out and they don't know where to go and who to talk to.
So what do you think is one of the barriers to people coming in and getting services and getting mental health support?
I think one of the biggest barriers is how we think about mental illness. The first and foremost thing being that most people have this idea that mental illness is something that's incredibly frightening. The person who lives on the street talking to him or herself, or the adolescent who goes and shoots up a mall or a school. But what we don't realize is that mental illness is on the face of every individual. I think first and foremost, the stigma is what keeps people from accessing services. The second is, are the services available, and how do people find them? Because most of the time, people don't want to acknowledge that there is a problem.
Right.
As a mental health practitioner, I would say that one of the biggest challenges for me is working with the individual where they're at, making sure they have the services or the funding needed to get the services they need, whether that be insurance constraints, time constraints with jobs, and overall, are the services that they need accessible in their community? And oftentimes people are reaching out for services and they're either not available because they're underfunded or they're overloaded.
So if someone was looking for services, what would you recommend as a first step? What's the first thing that they should do to find out where they can go?
Well, and that's an interesting question, because I had somebody call me the other day. I have a client who's in her early 20s and she's living at home with her mother, and her mother called me and said, I need to get her into an individual therapist. Things are progressing. They're getting worse at home. And she said, I need to get her in. I need to get her in now. And when I call these various therapists that people have identified for her, the waiting list is, we can see her at the end of August. We can see her in the beginning of September.
Okay.
And she's like, I need her to get in now.
Okay, yeah.
And so she was asking me if there was a way I could get her in quickly, if I knew of ways that that she could get services sooner rather than waiting 3, 4, 5 weeks, because this is a crisis situation.
Yeah.
People can't wait that long.
Yeah.
And we know what happens when people wait that long.
Yeah. So she was calling more some of the larger providers?
Right.
Clinics.
A list of clinics in her area. And the first thing I said to her was, one of the best things to do is to call your insurance provider and ask them if they have emergency appointments, because oftentimes some of the larger insurance corporations have, they set up contracts with therapists and have them keep open so many sessions per week.
Okay.
So if you call your insurance company and say, I have a situation, it's dire, my loved one or myself or whomever the case may be needs to get seen now, that's one way of checking and finding out. Another thing that I told her to do was to get her into the ER if things are taking a turn for the worse.
Yeah.
If she's indicating any suicidal ideation, if she's refusing to take care of herself, if she's not doing anything, or if she's doing stuff that appears to be harmful to herself or somebody else, that the mother should bring her in.
Yeah.
And she was concerned about that because she said, well, she's an adult. She just tells me to go mind my business. And
right. I think that's especially hard, that age, 18 to sort of those, I think above 18, but 18, 19, 20, technically legally an adult, but still maybe needing family support and still needing a parent there to help make appointments or to help guide and to help be a support for them to get the services. Like for you, does that become an issue if you're working with 18, 19-year-olds?
So many issues there. One is with boundaries, because the client can say to me, I don't want my parents involved with my care. That presents a problem when they're living at home with mom and dad say, well, you're staying here rent-free. We want to know what's going on because we come home every day from work and you're sitting in the basement, you're not doing anything, you're not functioning.
Yeah, you're not functioning well.
So
Things
you
aren't
can
going
stay
well.
here, but we want to know that you're doing something to take care of yourself.
Yeah.
And therein lies the rub.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of boundaries and then working with both the parents and the adult child to talk about what is going to work here, what's going to feel comfortable, what are the expectations. And sometimes it is me as a mediator between the parent and the child saying, you're an adult, mom and dad are letting you stay here, and there is some expectation that you take a hold of your mental health issues and get some help and start doing something to take better care of yourself. And that is a difficult conversation to have in any family.
Yeah, especially when, like you said, there's a stigma there. Nobody really wants to be struggling with the mental health.
Right. And oftentimes the parents will say, just get a job, just go to the gym.
Right.
Just hang out with your friends, do something. And they're not seeing that the underlying problem is the depression, the anxiety, OCD, anything that might be keeping them from getting out and being a functional adult.
And I think at times for people it feels so easy to if you just do these things, things will be better.
Right.
And in some ways, maybe that's a piece of it. But a lot of times family members or even the person themselves, they're just not informed.
Right. And I think that's what I said, we have to rethink how we view mental illness because people think that mental illness looks a certain way when they see, someone, whether it's their teenager or their millennial or whatever the case may be, or their spouse, and day in and day out they're struggling with symptoms of not wanting to get up and do things that they normally do, not having any joy, not having any motivation. Sometimes you just say, oh, they're being lazy.
Yeah.
They just need to go and do X, Y, and Z and everything will be fine. The problem with depression is A, it's very ambiguous, and B, it is treatable, but first you have to figure out what's going on. And oftentimes people will do the stigma of, well, they're just lazy. They used to do all of these things and now they'd rather just sit at home on the couch and watch Netflix instead of, let's get this person some help and let's see what's really going on. So it's my understanding, Jeanne, that you work more with children, and I'm just wondering what some of your challenges have been working with younger populations.
And I don't know if this would be a challenge, but In some ways it can be, but I think it's unique. And one of the reasons I really like working with kids is because you have the kid, but then you also have the parents. I think that brings its own challenges, because a lot of kind of how I approach a lot of my work with kids is helping them build their toolbox. So how I kind of explain it and work with them is, if you only have a hammer, you can only build so much. You can't use screws. You can't take things apart. You need to put more in your toolbox. So I kind of look at it as whether it's building social skills or emotional regulation skills, and then how can their parents help? And I think, some kids are really open. Some are, yep, I'd love to try that. And they come back the next week and they're so excited and they're like, here's what I did and here's what I tried. And other kids, it's really hard for them to try new things. With parents too, it's getting them to do things differently. And I think I always talk about that with both parents and kids, because I think it's good for kids to hear, it's not just there's something wrong with you. It's things, you're having some challenges. We're going to help you learn new tools, but hey, mom and dad are also going to try some new tools.
Does that pose some difficulties from time to time when you teach the skill to the child and you attempt to teach the skill to the parent, and then they kind of have their own little idea of how they want to do it?
Yeah. And I think it can be either one. It can be the kids are more willing and the parents are stuck, or vice versa. The kids like, nope, they're not coming from kind of the same reality.
So how do you get them to get on the same plane, so to speak, with the treatment plan?
Usually slowly. It can be a slow process. It's not, okay, here's your penicillin.
Right.
Your infection will clear up in 2 weeks. It's so much more of a process.
And identifying that it's a treatment, not a cure, and that there's no time limit. Getting well is not a race. And I think sometimes one of the challenges that we see both with kids and adults is that they want to get better and they want it to happen now, and the families want them to get better now. I imagine that presents a lot of challenges with parents who are wanting to see results.
Okay, Jill, so are there things that you think are important for someone to focus on or to pay attention to as they're trying to either recover from a mental illness, as they're trying to just have better health, better mental well-being?
Definitely, and I think that there are so many different options for people in terms of taking care of their wellness, health and wellness, and I think that as a society we're doing a better job of getting some of those things out there. Basic things like sleep, getting proper nutrition, movement, those are going to be important, as well as following up with either your primary care physician or your psychiatrist if you are taking medications for medication management. Support is huge. If you don't have strong family support, there is help out there. There's NAMI. There's various forms of sober support groups for people who are trying to stay sober. And then also finding a good therapist. And not all therapists are alike. I mean, we have different personalities, so we're going to have to find someone that we feel comfortable with.
Sure.
But I think one of the main things is just having hope. Having hope that things can get better, and then also using things like humor and keeping it light and try to enjoy the moment. Because I think what happens with this is that we get so wrapped up in what's going to happen next that we don't find ways to just be mindful. And how do we take care of ourselves in the best practices that we know how? And so I think just having that sense of hope and having people around us that are willing to see us through the process and walk with us through our journey is really a big deal.
Yeah. I like how you talk about the community and just reaching out.
Right.
NAMI and some of the support groups are really important. We're social creatures. We need people around us. We actually, we kind of crave that. And I know,
yes, we definitely
especially anxiety and depression, just kind of those major disorders, they can really isolate people, and they make you not want to be around other people. They make you they make it that harder for somebody to reach out. So
Right.
I think to focus on that you really do have to reach out to others, or for people to reach out to people they know who, sometimes just a phone call to somebody who you know is struggling
And I think
is the first step for them.
Yeah, I think the really cool part about running group therapy is when a group of people who have a form of mental illness come into a room and they each start sharing a little bit about themselves, and they realize that they're not the only person who's suffering with this disorder, whether it be depression, anxiety, addiction, schizophrenia. When they're around other people who understand and get it,
Yeah.
you see that hope start to increase.
Yeah.
And you see it in their faces, and you see it in their ability to talk with others, because they suddenly don't feel like the odd man out or odd woman out.
Right.
They know
Yeah.
that there are other people that get it.
Yeah, yeah. And maybe can make living with it not seem so hard, because there's a lot of
Right.
people that just live with it.
Right.
But to know that you can have depression, you can have anxiety, you can be a recovering addict and have a full life.
Exactly. People want to know that they can live with their illness and have a fulfilling existence, and still make connections, and still be able to have meaningful relationships with people, and have a future, and have a job, and just function as an individual,
Yeah.
instead of a person with a mental illness.
Right. First thing.
One of the things that occurred to me today as I listened to Jeanne Wolfe and Jill Kramer is that there might not be any magic solution to our problems. But no matter what the issue, depression, anxiety, drug, alcohol issues, it all starts with finding common ground with other people, acknowledging that there are issues, being able to discuss what's going on with our lives, because in the beginning and in the end, we need to talk. We Need to Talk, brought to you by the St. Louis Park Mental Health Action Committee. And we thank the folks from Southwest Community TV, from Hopkins, Eden Prairie, and Minnetonka.